Hey everyone, I think we can get started. This is the Soroban design discussion in which we discuss protocol changes related to Soroban. Our topic today is state expiration. We're going to keep talking about rent and temporary storage ledger entries. So, Garen, can you take it away?
So I think at the tail end of the last week's meeting, we were discussing about what happens when entries are deleted with outstanding rent balance. And we decided that it was probably not a good idea to refund the outstanding balance and instead just have the balance be burned. The reason for this is that if you allow rent balance refunds, then you open up a lot of kind of malicious attack vectors. For instance, because entries automatically have a rent bump whenever they're touched, you could have a smart contract that has every invocation of a function touch one admin entry, for instance. And then this admin entry, especially for a popular contract, could have lots of rent balance because it's touched on every function call. And then you could have an admin of this contract who maliciously deletes and recreates that entry periodically in order to essentially steal this rent balance from the callers of the function. And also, this would be difficult for users to be able to detect or even see that this attack vector exists. Because for something like an admin entry, it would seem like a normal operation for an admin of the contract to either create or modify that entry. And so it'd be difficult to detect these sorts of attacks. Also, refunding rent balance doesn't really make sense because many different users may pay for the rent balance, but only a single user benefits from the refund. And so for these reasons, it seems like the best policy for whenever an entry is deleted with outstanding rent balance is just for this rent balance to be burned. Now, even though we're burning this outstanding rent balance, we still want there to be an incentive to delete entries before they're archived. Because even though we have the state expiration to reduce the size of the ledger, whenever a restorable entry, or like that's what we're calling now, entries that are eligible for archival, so a non-temporary entry. But whenever these entries run out of rent, even though they're deleted from the ledger, they still have to be stored perpetually in the archive. And so if you have an entry that's no longer going to be used, it's significantly more advantageous for this entry to be deleted instead of being sent to the archive. Because even though the archive is kind of like our deep storage, and is much slower, and we have much more wiggle room there for large amounts of state, it would still be better just to have not to have useless entries or entries that will never be used again, taking up space in the ledger or the archive. And so, since we can't incentivize this behavior via a rent bounce refund, we're thinking instead of adding a base fee called the archival fee. And essentially, what this would be is just some flat fee, probably tied to the size of the ledger entry, that you have to pay in order to create the entry initially. And then if you delete the entry before it gets archived, you receive this as a refund. And so this allows you to have some incentive for deletion. And then if you don't delete an entry and it gets sent to the archive, then this archival fee is burned. And so the thinking being that this gives users incentive to delete entries before they get sent to the archive. But because it is a fixed rate and is not something that can grow to large amounts like rent balance, it can't be gamed nearly as much. And one of the drawbacks is that this does make the entries more expensive, and this also increases the size of the entry because we'll have to store the archival fee as a parameter, so it increases the size of all entries by about 4 bytes. But I think this provides a good incentive and can help us maintain the hygiene of the archive. And so I guess general thoughts on both the issue of burning rent balance that's outstanding and also on this new archival base fee.
So I think, I think on the rent balance getting burned, I think we're pretty much in agreement, unless someone else has a different opinion there. I am very much concerned about introducing yet another type of fee for the purpose of motivating people to delete their entries, especially because we already have temporary storage which hopefully should take care of like most of these cases. Like, what is? Can you give us a use case for like when a non-temporary uh, entry might get deleted, and how often do these happen?
Yes, this would just have to depend on usage patterns. And so one thing with the temporary entries is that their lifetime is fixed to a set amount or to a very limited time frame. And so this is both for security reasons, but also just for fee-based reasons as well. That temporary entries will have a maximum life of something probably on the magnitude of like months. So like 3 months or 6 months or something like that. The exact value hasn't been decided yet. So I think that there's a use case for, so you have something like a payment channel that doesn't need to be preserved, but you still want it to last longer than the maximum life of the temporary entry would be. And so I think for entry types like that, that aren't super important from a security standpoint, but have a variable length time or a variable length lifetime, then there might be some advantageous here for deletion. I think the second issue too is if we have this archival fee, it provides more incentive to use temporary entries as well. Because right now, the savings you get from a temporary entry are relatively minimal because they're still essentially how we calculate the temporary entry fee is that say if your temporary entry lasts 128 ledgers, what we do is that we take a snapshot of the current rent fee, multiply that by 128, and that's how much a temporary entry costs. And so today, a temporary entry and a restorable entry are very similar in price. And so I could see network incentives being well, they're essentially the same. So just to be on the safe side, I'll use a restorable entry when a temporary entry really could do. So that's the second advantage to having the space fee is that by adding this fee to the restorable entry types and not adding this fee to the temporary entry types, you also widen the gap between the cost of a temporary entry and a cost of a restorable entry to further incentivize more use of these temporary entries and less of the restorable entry type.
Have you considered any other options for widening the gap between um, temporary entries and restorable entries that doesn't include an archiver fee?
Well, so there's there's an implicit savings because the rent fee is snapshot, and because rent fee is tied to the bucket list size. Generally speaking, at least for the access patterns you're seeing on Stellar Classic, now this might vary because we haven't seen Soroban traffic yet in the real world. But the bucket list grows relatively linearly. And so because temporary entries are locking into the fee, and we expect the bucket list size and therefore the rent fees to increase linearly, you are getting a cheaper rate because you're able to snapshot. That being said, especially for short-lived entries, the savings are pretty minimal because the rent fee doesn't grow at a very fast rate. And so I think there, I'm trying to think if there are any other implicit fee savings at the moment. But I think if we want to incentivize temporary storage from a fee perspective, we will have to add some additional costs to the restorable entry counterparts. Now, whether that could be a refundable fee or a fee that's refunded on deletion, or just a fee of creation that's immediately burned, I think either of those could work. But I think we do need to have some sort of price discrepancy in addition to the implicit discrepancy in the rent fee snapshot. Alternatively, if we think that we don't need to incentivize the use of temporary entries from a fee perspective, and that just the utility they provide is good enough incentive on their own, we could also go that route. But that could cause more archivable and restorable entry types than we want floating around the network and make our archives larger than they really should be.
Um, yeah, the question is how much bigger will they get? Because this idea of like creating like this middle basically what you're saying here like is that there's a whole category of like ledger entries that are like between temporary and restorable that could theoretically like not be archived, and we're going to introduce another fee mechanism specifically for them and we already have a fairly, across the board, we have a non-trivial like fee, various fee mechanisms. So introducing another one is something that I'm um, not entirely comfortable with.
Yeah, I guess one other potential saving is just that the temporary entries never require proofs for creation, whereas some types of restorable entries require proofs, which is another difference that could be useful. So, for instance, in the unique storage type, requires a proof of non-existence to create, where temporary entries never require a proof. That being said, the recreatable storage type does not require such proofs. Um, but I think temporary entries are a powerful primitive on their own. And so I'm not sure how much we need to incentivize their use from a fee perspective. So I'm just curious as to people who know like the smart contract ecosystem better than me, are like the temporary entries strong enough on their own, and do we not need this additional archival incentive?
Yeah, so I think the main use case we're seeing for temporary storage is oracles. We've talked with some of like the major Oracle providers who would love to see this. Um, and so I don't think, even if there's even if there's like, even if with not a lot more fees they can get archivable storage, I don't think they'll be interested in doing this because again, their data is really short-lived, is relevant for a short-lived time. The other thing is that if like actually if we add this archiver fee, people will actually need to reclaim it, right? So that like we're basically adding an operational burden on these entities to actually reclaim their fees.
True, but I mean, but this doesn't replace temporary entries, right? So with the Oracle use case, you would still want temporary entries, of course. This doesn't replace that. I guess the question is there a good enough, or is deleting a restorable entry happen often enough to add the complexity of an extra fee and to add the additional 4 byte um, archival fee value? Right now, I'm hearing no, that that's probably not a use case that will happen very often. Am I kind of like appropriate in thinking that?
Yeah, I guess my opinion on Stan is clear. Is there anyone else with thoughts on the matter?
What is the cost of letting this go to archives? Like getting having a archivable entry, like go to the archives instead of it getting deleted.
Also, just the thing about the archive is that it never shrinks. So if an entry gets archived, then you have to store that in the archive. Versus if the entry gets deleted, then you don't have to store it. In addition, even once an entry is restored from the archive, we still have to keep essentially a stub of its existence in the archive. So what happens is that whenever an entry is restored, its leaf node that used to store the ledger entry is nulled out, but the path to the node still needs to be maintained for all eternity. And so I think just given that the archive is pretty much append only, it is designed such that this is like a slow data structure that's meant to be like the archive nodes are essentially just like SSD base, and they're meant for storing large amounts of data, and so it's not nearly as sensitive as the ledger size. But it is something that we should probably keep in mind, as that if we send something to the archive, at least some of that data, even if it's restored later, will have to live forever. Which is why if there's an entry that a user will never use, I would much rather that entry be deleted than having to store it perpetually in an archive, even though archives are kind of meant to store things perpetually.
Based off of what you said, like I would expect temporary, like I think you mentioned that the fee difference between temporary storage and non-temporary storage is like negligible, but I would expect it to be somewhat significant just based off what you said.
What do you mean?
It would make sense if we made temporary storage cheaper to not incentivize what you're describing, where just like using recreatable storage.
So that's actually another thing we could do is instead of adding an additional fee to archival storage, what we could say is right now, temporary storage is just the fee calculation is just number of ledgers to live times current rent fee. What we could do is just say like numbers of ledgers to live times current rent fee times like 0.8 or some like temp fee multiplier, such that the temporary entries are still based on the current size of the bucket list. And so they can still increase or decrease in price as the ledger state grows or shrinks, but they're strictly cheaper than archive entries by a significant margin. And that also kind of simplifies the fee story because we're not adding an additional fee type because we already have separate fees for temporary entries. And so this would just make them always smaller. That would actually probably be a much simpler and better idea than I think having this refundable archival fee thing.
Yeah, although I guess this doesn't incentivize like actual deletion of those entries, but I think we would see less of them.
Yeah, I think if temporary entries are significantly cheaper, or at least substantially cheaper, then we don't really need to incentivize deletion. Because if you're thinking about like what the use case for restorable entries are, especially for like the recreatable type, it's pretty much just balances. And I mean, I think the amount of balanced deletions is probably pretty small, and so I don't think it's probably a huge case, a special case for it.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think if we figure out a way to discount the temporary entries the way that you described, that will go a long way towards making people use them. And in terms of the previous point on saving space for archivers, I hear you. The question there is like how much like makes it worth it? Like if we save them 10% of space, like does that is that worth the added complexity? Like obviously if we can save archivers an order of magnitude space or reduce an order of magnitude the amount of space required, then that is like a huge win. But I don't think we'll get there. I think there's like a pretty narrow use case for these deletable restorable entries. So definitely my vote is for like the discount approach for temporary storage.
Yeah, I think I'm blaming the discount approach too. I think also just like on the our order of priorities, we should prioritize keeping the ledger small, and not prioritize keeping the archive small that much. Especially if it's like I think like a 10% decrease wouldn't be that big of a deal. So I think I'm also leaning towards the discount temporary entries approach as well. Are there any last thoughts before we move on? I guess the conclusion was discount temporary entries and have no refunds for archival storage.
Just maybe like the thing like I'm thinking of is that if we go that route where we basically say, hey, the archives are kind of a dumping ground of like all abandoned ledger entries. I think what we have to maybe like take into account is I think it's probably okay. Like so, I mean, imagine that those nodes that are going to be used as to back up those high value ledger entries, they probably will end up doing some level of filtering. Like they only, for example, keep around pre-images for things that look like balances, for example, or that are related to balances as opposed to like random stuff. But I think even in that situation, I think they have to keep the full tree around, right, of hashes. So how often do we reset the tree? Is it like on a pair? What are those epochs where we kind of restart the tree?
It's currently year epochs.
It's every year. So then the assumption will be that in a year we don't have too much of this craft accumulating, which might be okay. There might be a constraint factor there. I mean, that's going to be kind of like I think for those entries that are not like, you were talking about it as a discount to get to the for the pricing of like temps. I think it's the other way around. It's more like you add actually. So there's probably like a constant term and then a additional rate on top of the price to get to the restorable entry fee. Like the very first time you create the thing, I think there's probably a constant factor.
I did want to bring Ian from the crowd to speak because he has some interesting perspective and is very passionate about it.
Sorry, I was so passionate. I've written papers on this topic for other blockchains as a paid service. So I've done a wide breadth of study as well as deep diving into different trade-offs that were done. And this influenced their design decisions, but they're slow to move and slow to change. So there's a couple different concepts here. The first one I want to cover is dust. And that's the idea that the value of a record may be less than the cost of maintaining it. And those records should probably be cleaned up automatically. It's a problem on Ethereum because you can never quite spend out a whole wallet. You always have a little bit left over. And so that little bit left over is referred to as dust. But that's only one example of dust. There's many of them. The second kind of approach here is that there's a huge ecosystem that's growing around smart contracts. And each of those ecosystem players has different data needs. And there's no one solution that fits everybody. Even other monolithic chains are dealing with storage problems. And then any modular chain has an extreme storage problem. And the storage problem needs to be addressed in a way that you don't have nodes needing to install like 4 different protocols, 4 different systems in order to access the data that's being referenced. Sometimes it might be 10 or 15 different storage protocols in order to access what was in a hash, what was in a rollup, what was intended by the data that was submitted to the blockchain.
Ian, I want to stop you for 1 second. In the context of the current state expiration proposal by Garen, what are you trying to say?
So you need to have different tiers of pricing. A rent model is insufficient, and so is a couple other, we see this problem now, what are we going to do? There's not one solution that fits it. It's really important to give a lot of flexibility to the people that are deploying on the network and give them as many options with pricing up front. And they will simply do whatever's most efficient in order to save money up front. If you try to add an incentive like later on, there's a few problems. One is that your adoption is going to be very low, and the second is that you're not going to have what they're necessarily looking for. Now, if they can just pay again to extend the lifetime of that storage, then that's the best of both worlds. Ideally, there'll be an external storage for large amounts of data. For example, blob data should be not stored necessarily on-chain, but on a separate layer. And you can incentivize the creation of those systems by limiting the amount of on-chain storage, but allowing pointers to exist. So your best long-term solution when people start doing crazy things with blockchain, which they're starting to, but they're struggling to because the storage costs are so high, is that you're going to start seeing a lot of flexibility wins the day. And so if you have pricing tiers, automatic expiration, optional renewal, and you're charging by the byte, by the day, or in some cases by the minute, then you're able to meet most of those use cases. Go ahead, please.
I believe this is what we're pretty much doing. I could be mistaken, but if I'm understanding your proposal correctly, it's that we have different tiers that automatically expire with the option to renew. I believe that's what we're doing with the temporary entries. The temporary entries being automatically deleting and being the cheapest, whereas the restorable entry types must be periodically renewed, so to speak. Are you proposing something that's different than this?
Well, I heard different proposals, and I think that I embrace what you're saying in terms of tiered proposals. I would just suggest, number one, that there's a large number of tiers, at least 4. And number 2, some of the data will be archived with no ability to recall, or excuse me, excluded from archive with no ability to recall. Some can be removed and not archived, but pay an oracle to recall it. And some can be, permanently archived.
Now, I'm confused by you saying remove, but you can pay an oracle to call it. What do you mean by that? I believe that's how our archival system is, that when it's sent to the archive is off-chain, and then you pay to restore them from the archive. So I believe our archive proposal is essentially the oracle system you're talking about.
So if it's an optional flag, they can pay for it if they think they need it, but your archive is still smaller. The reason that you might want to do that is that some people specialize in storage and they want to earn a fee for specializing in storage. And by specializing, I mean over 20 terabytes, probably around, a petabyte or so.
Okay, so I think Ian, if you can maybe refer back, we can drop a link here to the actual proposal, and we'd love to hear feedback about it specifically. I think that the type of issues that you are, or the type of solutions you're talking about, are actually embedded there. But we'd love to hear if you think that's not the case.
Yeah, I think we're kind of
I'll write you something. That'd be great.
We're delving into details now, but I believe the archival system is pretty similar to what you proposed, actually. But you can definitely add some comments in the docs. So I guess, are we ready to move on to temporary entry issues?
I think
Or
so.
do we still want to? Okay. So I guess the second thing, and this is somewhat relevant to the previous conversation, is temporary entries. So our current interface, and I guess we've concluded that the temporary entries are substantially cheaper than the restorable entry types by some multiplier or something like that. If we have the temporary entries, currently the interface is you define a key, define a value, and define a TTL measured in ledgers, such that, or time to live, such that the entry is guaranteed to be deleted on the exact ledger that you specify. Now, systematically under the hood, the entry is not actually removed on that ledger. It persists in the bucket list for that some time, but it is inaccessible. Now, one of the open questions we have is whether or not we should allow users to increase the TTL arbitrarily. And in the current proposal, we do not allow this. There are 2 reasons. There's a security reason and a gamification reason. So first, for the security reason, we suspect that there is a strong use case for temporary entries when it comes to things like allowances or KYC, where if you specify an allowance that should only last 10 ledgers, it should last exactly 10 ledgers. And by allowing contracts to define behavior that increases TTL, you can have foot guns, where a buggy implementation might have some security, a temporary authorization that should only last a short amount of time. But by allowing life extension primitives, you are potentially allowing bugs for security purposes. That's issue number 1. Issue number 2 is that of gamification. And so the whole issue with temporary entries is that we want them to be cheaper, but we don't want them to be a way to game the rent system. And what I mean by that is if continually extending the TTL of a temporary entry is cheaper than just paying rent, that kind of skews network dynamics. Now, I'm not exactly sure, actually, this is something we should avoid because temporary entries are deleting. So maybe we should allow users to just continually extend the life and essentially have cheaper rent than if they would have created a restorable entry and just paid rent balances on those ledgers. So perhaps this is something we want to allow, but at least for now, it seems that that's a somewhat unfair usage of the temporary entries, and we wouldn't want temporary entries to be used and to be able to continually extend their TTL such that they can drastically or pay significantly reduced amounts of rent. And so in our current system, we do not allow modification of the TTL. Now, there is an implicit way to extend the life of an entry. What you can always do is load the entry, delete it, and then recreate the entry with the exact same value. That's still allowed. And so you can essentially, by this delete rewrite pattern, special case and extend the entry with the same key value if you really want to. But we provide no way to essentially keep the same entry but extend the TTL. And so I'm wondering if there are any additional thoughts on this. Should we allow arbitrary TTL extension? Should we not?
This is a slight side point, maybe, and kind of a question. It seems like the difference between restorable entries and temporary entries is temporary entries, you have to, well, this is your question, I guess, is should we allow rent bumps or is it prepay only for temporary entries? But it seems like the only real difference is restorable ones go to the archive and temporary ones do not go to the archive. Is that roughly true or not quite?
Yeah, correct. There's a couple of other differences. Like, so right now, like temporary entries are prepay up front, and so you get a better rate because you're paying essentially like for months, like you're paying for a large amount of ledgers instead of one-offs.
I guess I'm saying, could we just have one type of thing that there's basically two different things? There's how much rent it has, which is how long it stays on chain, and then whether or not you've paid for it to go to the archive after that point or not, right? And if you pay more rent up front for either of them, you get a discount. And then this whole cheaper way to use it goes away.
So I think we should define a difference, and that's because the primary difference, and I should have mentioned this, is that temporary entries have strict lifetimes, whereas right now restorable entries do not have strict lifetimes. And so just the way that the bucket list works, we have a variable per ledger rent fee, and because it's variable, we don't know what the rent fee of a given ledger will be until that ledger occurs. Which means in order for the database to be up to date on the live rent values of every entry, we have to iterate through the entire ledger and decrement the rent balance of every single entry, which is impossible from an efficiency standpoint. And so because of this, we charge rent retroactively, which means that for restorable entries, they live and are accessible longer than they should be. The exact number is that we have about on the lowest level bucket, we have right now about 30 days of quote unquote free rent, where a restorable entry has run out of rent, but is still accessible and live. Temporary entries have very definite timelines, whereas they only exist for 128 ledgers, no more, no less. And I think that's a powerful primitive for security purposes, which is one of the reasons we want to distinguish between the two.
Yeah. Okay, but were you just asking about if we should allow rent bumps for temporary entries?
Well, so not necessarily rent bumps, but TTL extension. And so in the current proposal, the rent system applies to restorable entries, whereas they have a rent balance, which is some amount of XLM, which is deducted from. And so their amount of ledgers to live is not exact. The quote unquote rent bump for temporary entries isn't increasing the rent balance because temporary entries do not have a rent balance. Rather, it's increasing the TTL. And so even if you allow changing of TTLs, it's not so much a rent bump because you still have a very definitive timeline and a very definitive depth ledger, if you will.
Okay. I think I still don't really see the difference, but I'm less familiar with the bucket DB, so I'll defer to you on that. Thank you.
My bias is not to allow extending the TTL. It's just another piece of functionality that people need to wrap their head around. But also, it doesn't sit that well with how my mental model of what a temporary ledger entry is. So when I think about a temporary ledger entry, I think about a piece of information that I'm broadcasting to the world for the next n ledgers, and that's it. So if I update that, like what does that actually mean? Like what is the actual use case for updating these temporary ledger entries?
Yeah, I personally don't know what the use case is. I think one possible advantage of updating the entries is if you have a some type that is trivially recreatable, so you don't care if it gets deleted, but you also want it to exist somewhat perpetually. I could imagine a efficient solution where if the TTL is below, like, say, 100 ledgers or something, then you just extend it arbitrarily. And if, for whatever reason, you miss a TTL bump and it does get deleted, you just arbitrarily recreate it. And so in this case, you wouldn't want to use an archivable type because it's trivially recreatable, and so it wouldn't be worth restoring. But also, you want to use it perpetually, and so you wouldn't want a strict TTL. Now, again, what you could also do is just like do a temporary entry, set to the maximum TTL, and then if it doesn't exist, just recreate it, and then again set to the max TTL. That's also possible for arbitrarily recreatable data, but that's just a use case I could think of off the top of my head. I don't know if anyone else has perhaps more interesting or is more knowledgeable in the smart contract space wants to share their thoughts.
Well, I guess maybe like with this TTL thing, like why are we trying to babysit so much like the contract, like it feels like not allowing access of an entry right past its TTL, that's like and not allowing bumps for that reason sounds like we are stepping over the boundary in terms of responsibility. Like the contract, if the contract doesn't want something to be valid beyond a certain time, like that TTL should be implemented in the contract itself, I think. And if we do something like that, I think then the bumping that we're talking about, I think we just have to make sure that when an entry gets bumped, the number, the actual expiration time will match the lifetime in the bucket list, right? Like so like if you're at creation time, that means we have to have like a function that allows you to compute the like if you want to go from a number of ledgers or a number or actually number of ledgers, you can do that off chain, but like or actually time is the same thing. So yeah, like I guess bumping, like where it gets a little bit complicated is you have like some number and then you're trying to say, okay, extend it by at least 30 days because you won't be able to actually do exactly 30 days if we don't make that strict TTL, and you don't want people to pay to get free runs, right, for whatever is the it takes to merge to actually expire that entry. But that seems workable. I mean, those are like helper functions, right? Like that we can expose to that are basically like allow you to kind of reason about the bucket list.
Well, I guess the interface would be a little weird though, because essentially what you could do is the TTL, you could make temporary entries, but it would have to be a power of 4 ledgers, so like 4 to 0, 4 to 1, etc., with a maximum lifetime being 30 days. And it just seems like a weird and not super user friendly interface to not have a strict bound on a TTL, because at least like when I'm thinking of like the use case, it just seems from a contract developer perspective, they don't have knowledge of the bucket list, and so it just seems weird that you have this temporary entry that can only expire on powers of 4 for some reason, with poor granularity, and I think it's weird from a security standpoint if you want something to only live 128, that you have this entry type called temporary entries that is self-deleting, but you, on top of the self-deleting temporary entry, have to still, in addition to that, implement your own TTL if for your use case it doesn't work to be on the exact boundary power of 4. It just seems that like we're exposing too much of the underbelly of the system to the developers in that case.
So just to be clear, if I use a non-power of what is it, power 4 number, it will still live until like past my TTL until the next power 4.
Yeah, so the way that just because of the nature of the bucket list and bucket list DB, we can only remove entries from the data structure on power of 4 ledgers. And so in the current implementation, we have the TTL, which is stored as a field inside the entry. And so the entry itself does live on the bucket list beyond the TTL in most cases, unless it happens to be a power 4. But we just like do a check whenever you're trying to access that entry. And if the TTL ledger has passed, we just return null as if it doesn't exist, even though it does exist on the ledger, and then we garbage collect on powers of 4.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm a bit confused as to what Nico just said. Like, what's the confusing bit here?
Well, so I think Nico is suggesting not to have the TTL field as part of the protocol, and to if users want a strict TTL, they must implement that themselves, and essentially their struct that they store must have the TTL value, and instead just expose an interface where temporary entries live and are accessible as long as they're accessible on the bucket list. And so when you specify a TTL, you must specify a power 4 TTL. Nico, am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, basically it's kind of like I mean, you still have a TTL. It's more like it's actually it's more, it represents the, we will in special case the like right now, right? Like if you have if you load an entry that is in the bucket list but that has an expired TTL, you consider that it's not there, and that we would get rid of that special casing by doing that, and just requiring that the TTL that you have is actually going to expire on the bucket boundary. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Garen. I think this has the potential. Like there's only so much we can expect from developers to understand the bucket list here, and I think the basic expectation from a temporary storage is, saying, telling the platform this is how many ledgers I want this thing to live for, and putting restrictions on that, or telling people you can only use powers of 4, and if you want to do it like an exact TTL, then you need to write your own smart contract. I think that's not the ideal product experience.
Yeah, I think
Sure.
it's,
The reason I mentioned that was to allow for bumping the TTL, because if you have actually, if you want to allow bumping, you have to take into account what is actually happening under the covers.
I don't know if it's too complex, but I kind of think we're solving 2 different problems here. I think there is the case of a temporary entry where that has a strict deadline and dies, and then such as like a KYC or like an allowance you want to exist for 10 ledgers and 10 ledgers exactly. That's case 1. And then there's the second case of you have this entry, you don't really care how long it lives as long as it lives around this time, and then you might want to bump it on every access. I feel like those are 2 different classes of storage. And I think the temporary entry with a exact TTL solves one issue. And so I'm wondering if it might be reasonable to have like a flag, say, on the recreatable storage to say archive or not archive. Because I feel like that's a different use case than what, at least in my mind, the temporary entry with an exact TTL is getting at. But again, that might be too complicated having now like 3 or 4 different storage types, or
Yeah, I would rather not add anything else here. I think that the first case that you described, the one that a contract wants to put a ledger entry for exactly n ledgers, I think that's the common case, and that's the thing that we should cater for. If they want to have more sophisticated situations in which they can recreate or bump this entry once in a while, then they can write a smart contract that achieves that functionality that can be updated at specific times. But I think we need to keep the main contract as something that's like the common use case.
Yeah, and I think if you want to essentially like implement that behavior, it's still possible. But just like if like the TTLs within X number of ledgers just deleted and recreate the same value with a maximum TTL, that's very possible. And especially if we have a discount on temporary entries, the deletion recreation path might be at cost or cheaper than a restorable entry. So I think that seems like a reasonable approach. And I think I'd rather not expose bungless powers of 4 to any host function or SDK.
Okay, it seems fine to not expose it then, but at the same time, like if we focus more on the actual, what is that TTL? Is it do we want that to be a more of a leave at least for a given time, and that way you can allow anybody to bump that ledger entry? Or do you want to have that be more like that strict thing, like that you mentioned? And because the strict definition of TTL seems super, I don't know, a bit too special. I don't know, like it doesn't seem like it's implicit. It's not. It's unlike other types of storage that we have.
I disagree here. Like I think the interface that people are looking for is, I want this to live for this amount of time. And the ledger number here is just a good approximation for time. Like this idea of I wanted this thing to live for at least this amount of time, and the actual length of how much it lives depends on like the underlying implementation.
That's not the case anymore, because what we said, the discussion we had right before was, hey, let's move the use cases where people don't want archival to those temporary entries. And in that context, the TTL is not about having this strict thing, right, going on. It's about, I don't want to parent, I just want to be, cheaper, and if I have to refresh the thing, I'll get it refreshed in some way. And the contract in that case is not the one necessarily responsible for refreshing the TTL. It's for anybody that cares, basically, in that context.
Yeah, I don't know. In my mind, it still feels like Tom was talking about issue A, and then Nico is tackling issue B. Those just seem like two fundamentally different use cases.
Because now what we're saying is that if people don't want this strict TTL, they are pushed to use archival, like those things that end up in the archives, and therefore end up also on the more expensive train.
But what exists in this space between a strict TTL and archivable entries? What like give me an example. Like what lives in that space?
Like the strict TTL is another layer of, like, the strict TTL. I mean, I'm fine with the strict TTL. It's more like the what does it actually mean? What do we mean by strict TTL here? Like it becomes a security feature. I'm saying, like, if we get rid of the security feature, basically allowing the TTL to be extended, then we have something actually that to me seems to make sense, because now we have, like, if you want to get into archive, use the recruitable thing, and it's kind of a you just use run for that, or you use those temporary things that, if you want to refresh, it's manual, you have to do that, and you get a little bit of a discount because they don't go to the archive by default. And then if you want the strict, like super strict thing that never exactly a TTL that's exactly something, and you cannot bump, you have to implement that in your contract. Because yeah, again, like in terms of use cases, what type of entry? When do you need something with a TTL that is kind of frozen, that you can never change?
Well, if you're in Oracle and you have, you publish like hourly price feeds and you want them to live exactly for an hour, then you put a TTL of n number of blocks that constitute fairly like something that approximates an hour.
You mean like you don't want that thing to stay on ledger for longer? You're going, I mean, as an Oracle in that particular scenario, you're going to override that entry, right?
Well, I think you're getting into the contract implementation. You can just
Yeah, no,
create
but I mean
new
in terms
entries
of what you say,
what
like
you would
the use case here is I'm publishing some data and I don't want to pay for it, after that time. It doesn't mean that.
No, it's not about I don't want to pay. It's not just about I want to pay for it for an hour. It's about this thing is relevant for an hour. Like I don't actually want this thing to be alive after an hour.
That's part of the payload. Like this expiration is the contract puts that meaning. Like you're saying there are no use cases where you don't want like you don't want this strict thing. And from the chat, a lot of people seem to disagree with that notion.
So what we could do actually is, if I've heard an abstraction, we could just like round up to the nearest power of 4 or something like that, and just like allow like users to say arbitrary ledgers, and it may or may not last longer. Because I think, I don't know, as a storage medium, I'm starting to agree more with Nico, such that I don't know if we need a special case of security feature in a storage interface, because I think perhaps we should make the storage interface more general. I don't know.
Well, what I'm saying is that I think it makes sense to the usability aspect of yeah, when you say the TTL is like 10 ledgers, right? If you don't do anything, after 10 ledgers, that thing is basically appears to be deleted, even though it's still in the bucket list. I think that's an implementation detail, right? And I think that's totally fine to have that. At the same time, I think it should be possible to bump that TTL if you want to go beyond 10 ledgers. And when you bump it, I mean, that means you have to pay for, I mean, it's not staying in the bucket list, right? It's not going to stay at the bottom. It's basically kind of like a rewrite. That's how we're going to implement it. And then, yeah, in terms of security feature, you wouldn't be able to rely strictly on that layer for security, for guaranteeing that something is going to live exactly, for some time. Like if you want that, you have to put that in as part of attach it to your data, basically.
Okay, so Garen, it sounds like we are at a bit of an impasse right now, and we probably need to kind of like regroup, look at the pros and cons. Can you like summarize this discussion and the pros and cons of the different approaches that we've discussed, and potentially drop that on Soroban Dev later today? And hopefully we can asynchronously regroup and think about this. Am I still on? Garen, can you hear me?
I mean, I can hear you. I don't know if Garen can.
Thanks, Paul. Maybe Garen is having some troubles connecting, and he is typing something. No, we cannot hear you, Garen. Regardless, we are almost at time right now. So I think this is a good stopping point to regroup and think about these things moving forward. Garen will hopefully share this on Soroban Dev, and we can continue the discussion there. We can also, people can feel free to stick around in live chat and continue talking. Thank you all for joining, and see you all next week.